Thank you for having us. My name is Taryn Rose Frazier. So in terms of pedigree, that means my parents, oh yes, higher, better. That means my parents are Greg and Jessie Rose, and my grandparents are Jamie and Julie Pendleton, and Dawn and Nolene Rose. My husband is Pierce Frazier, who's the assistant pastor up in Kempton. And we have a little daughter up there with us too. I'm also a member of the General Church Helping Children in Crisis Committee, which is HCIC. Most of the evening I'd like to give over to Wade, who's one of the founding members, but by way of introduction, I'd like to tell you a story with a happy ending. During dinner, you may have noticed up on the big screen pictures of African children scrolling by. These are orphans in the Sacred Care Orphanage in Itora, Kenya. And there are 65 kids there right now. One of these is Millicent, who's an 11-year-old girl. She was in there somewhere. She lost her mother to AIDS. We don't know much about her father. And she lived on the street until she started following the New Church children to Sunday school. And the minister there, Reverend Samson Abuga, took her and her brother in, and she's now in the 6th grade, and Samson tells us that she is happier than before. As HCIC finds sponsors for kids, the quality of life for Millicent and the other kids at the school is improving. And studies overall show that sponsorship makes a huge difference for a child like Millicent. And I have some numbers for you. Kay Alden, who is also here and a member of our committee, circulated an article called "Want the World to Change? Sponsor a Child." And a guy who's a development economist named Bruce Wittick put it together. And I just wanted to briefly throw out a few statistics surrounding sponsorship programs worldwide. So Millicent and kids like her are 27 to 40% more likely to complete secondary school, 50 to 80% more likely to finish college, 14 to 18% more likely to get a salaried job, and 35% more likely to get a white-collar job. So just by being at the orphanage and having support, Millicent is looking at a much brighter future. And perhaps most importantly are the intangibles. Kids who are sponsored in a program like this report higher self-esteem, and they have greater expectations for themselves in the future. Perhaps most importantly, and I think this has some spiritual aspect to it too, Millicent and kids like her have the chance to leave the category of receivers and become givers and contributors. She's no longer as vulnerable. And I think that has some real spiritual implications. The General Church minister there at Sacred Care Orphanage is Samson Abuga, and he and his staff go above and beyond the call of duty taking care of these kids. But they really are struggling to make ends meet. So we formed HCIC to help them and people like them out. And this is where we come in. I want to leave it to Wade to speak about the nuts and bolts, but I wanted to thank you again for having us.
So I wanted to follow up Taryn's great remarks, and the first thing that occurred to me while she was speaking is that, so she mentioned that there's 65 children in that orphanage, and I think we can be guaranteed that there are 64 more equally interesting and fascinating stories about those children, and stories that come from a place of extreme need that collectively we're all trying to help them fulfill themselves and be in a position where they can be contributors and givers. And like you, I suspect there's something very spiritual about that. And I think it's interesting to explore, but the opportunity to help them become contributing members of our society, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So I also want to echo the thanks for letting us come and speak to you tonight. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I think part of performing uses in the church is including everybody in the church and the opportunity to perform those uses. And Cairnwood Village, I think, represents a very important part of the church and a part of that of our church and our societies that we want to be a part of in performing this use. So thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you tonight and explain a little bit about what we're trying to do. So by way of introduction, and also along the pedigree route, my name is Wade Buick. I'm the youngest of Bill and Barbara's children. I won't go any more generations than that. I think that's enough because they're sitting here. Just to establish a little bit of credibility around what our effort is working on, we have a number of people. Kay is here, who is our chair of the committee, that have some experience in doing this type of work. But that doesn't mean that we think, we're great at this and we want to try doing it. No, it actually comes from a very sincere need. So these 65 children are not children that Samson sought out because he wanted to have an orphanage. They are children that really have no other option. So he looked for homes for them. He looked for other orphanages that could provide for them, and there simply was nothing available to them. So Samson took stock of what was around him and he said, I have to do this. And the congregation around him said, we're going to do this. And they reached back to Bernathen for help. And that's when Kay and others said, okay, let's do this. We can do this together. And the General Church agreed, after helping us build an organization around the smart way to do it, the right way to do that we can try and serve the needs that these children so desperately need help with. So that's kind of the context for why we started up HCIC, and that's a little bit about the rationale. So I wanted to briefly read from the Reverend David Lindruth's charge to HCIC and why doctrinally we should be a part of the church. And he is, as you know, the director of the Office of Outreach. So I just wanted to read this quickly, if you'll permit me. So in his words, he writes, the heavenly doctrines emphasize that the Lord is especially present to those who care for others who cannot care for themselves. This is the origin of the love of offspring that parents feel for their children. It is an affection that comes directly from the Lord himself through his heavens. Because the Lord operates so powerfully through the care of offspring, the General Church has historically had a special calling for serving the uses of protection, care, and education of children. So when we think about HCIC and specifically the opportunity in eTorah, it really does seem to have a direct correlation to what the doctrines are teaching us around the doctrine of charity and what our opportunity and really responsibility as people in the church is to live a life in the world and do charitable and good acts. So I just wanted to cover some of that ground before we get into, as Taryn mentioned, the nuts and the bolts about how we operate. Because we acknowledge that trying to help children that are in the most desperate of situations make those situations inherently difficult to understand what different factors are at play and what the risks might be. So the General Church, by providing its support to us and extending the umbrella of resources that the church represents, that makes a responsibility on those of us in the committee to make sure we're doing everything we can to limit the amount of risk that the church as an organization is exposed to by undertaking these types of efforts. So I'll just speak briefly about why do we have to do those things more broadly. And to do that, I want to bring up 3 illustrative stories. So is everybody familiar with Oprah Winfrey? Yeah. Oprah Winfrey is one of the more, I think, recognizable names probably in the world. And Oprah Winfrey, a number of years ago, decided that she wanted to make an effort around helping girls in South Africa. And Oprah Winfrey used all of her resources. And when you think of an individual that has, in natural terms, pretty much infinite resources and notoriety and ability to network with people, Oprah Winfrey would be one that would come to mind. So Oprah said she wanted to start a girls' academy, which is a wonderful thing for disadvantaged girls in South Africa who showed some academic prowess. She wanted to set up an academy to further that for them and help them grow. And she went through probably a lot of the same steps that we have gone through and put the full resources of her network and power to play. Unfortunately, within the first year of operation, allegations of abuse to some of the girls surfaced. Those allegations are still going through some court proceedings, but a number of them are proven to be factual. So even with all of her resources, she was not able to completely protect the children. So I think there's a lesson there for us. The second story that I wanted to bring up as a way to illustrate how important some of the policies that we're trying to put in place is around an individual named Greg Mortensen. Is anybody familiar with the book 3 Cups of Tea? There's a follow-on book called Stones into Schools. Greg, I think, coming from a similar place, an incredible volunteer spirit and an incredible desire to help people in situations where the need was so clearly dire, had set about doing this in a different way. Nobody knew who Greg Mortensen was, but he had this incredible spirit. And he built up around an effort to build schools in Afghanistan and Pakistan a network of resources that was impressive. And he traveled all over the world speaking on behalf of these children, primarily, again, girls, to raise money for this pursuit, and was extremely successful. They built over 30 schools in Afghanistan alone in a period of about 6 years, and brought education to individuals that would never otherwise have it. Unfortunately for Greg, there was a case, well, at first there was some news articles that started to have allegations of him misusing funds that he had been raising. So their fundraising was incredible. They had a virtual machine. He would go everywhere and speak to audiences all over the world, raise millions of dollars. And some news articles broke that Greg was in fact probably misusing those funds. And eventually the Attorney General of Montana, which was the home state where his nonprofit was based out of, brought charges against Greg, and he was found guilty in a court of law of Montana and ordered to pay $1 million of his own money back to his organization, which was called Central Asia Institute. Now, I don't think financially, that wasn't that big of a deal, I think. But where the damage was done is through his reputation that was tarnished, and then the effect it had on his organization. Because there's been no more books. You hear very little about Greg Mortensen and his effort to raise money. And so when you think of what he was able to achieve prior to that point, and now if we continue to follow Greg, much, much less. So there's another lesson there for us around how do you do this right? How do you do this work right? The last story that I wanted to bring up, and hopefully help us tie all these together, is from my own experience. So I spent a number of years in the military, and I had the opportunity to serve on a team that's called a provincial reconstruction team. And essentially, provincial reconstruction teams operated like nonprofit organizations or NGOs in places, again, like Afghanistan, to do similar type of work that Greg was doing. We would build schools, we'd build medical clinics, bridges, roads, infrastructure, all sorts of development type of work that was required in a place like that. And there was one day when we were going out to look at a bridge that we had helped resource and fund, and there was a little boy who was about maybe 4 years old, and maybe a little taller than that. And often when we go on these missions, children would come around you, and they would ask for candy or water or whatever it may be, and they would often crowd into you. And we knew this, so we had kind of training procedures in place to not let them get near your weapons, because we were in the military and we were in a dangerous place, so we did have weapons on us. So this little boy bumped into me a couple of times. He bumped into my right leg a couple of times, and that happened to be where I left, where my pistol was holstered. And it was harmless. Nothing happened at the moment, and we got back in our trucks and we were driving home. The day was over, and the soldier next to me looked over at my pistol, and he noticed that the boy not only was able to take the safety off, he was able to put the weapon in a position where if someone just bumped it hard enough, it could have gone off. It could have fired a bullet. And what I think is fascinating and scary and depressing all at once about that story is not necessarily that the boy would do that, because he didn't necessarily understand what he was doing, but somebody took the time to teach him to do that for whatever reason. And so the lesson to me there was, when you're in a situation that's very foreign to yourself and you're trying to do development work, you have no idea what's going on in the lives of the people that you may even be trying to help directly. So that, again, is another warning for when you're trying to do this work. If you don't have some type of structure that helps you reduce the risk, reduce your exposure to situations where you could have had a gun that went off and hurt somebody. Not that we'll ever be in that case, but the lesson is there. So what do we learn from Oprah? If we ever have great influence and power and networks, that alone is not enough. We have to have policies in place and risk mitigation measures in place that will help us not have a great amount of resources go astray. If we're ever, our second lesson then is, if we're ever lucky enough to be like Greg Mortensen and have a lot of people know about us and again, have a great fundraising vehicle, we have to always be certain that we're following procedures to use that money according to how we've told all of our donors and sponsors that we're using it, and very much everybody that we work with and speak with. And then the last lesson is the volunteer spirit and the drive to be charitable is a wonderful thing, but we never can know for certain what the lives of the people that we're trying to help are like. So we can't project our own reality on what their day-to-day lives are like. We have to have partners in that who help us understand exactly what their needs are. So that brings me back to explaining a little bit more about the nuts and bolts. So what are our policies? And I'll only briefly delve into some that I think are the most important. But they're all designed to help us not get those things wrong. There's a lot of lessons out there, and we don't want to be naive to those. And this is also, we are limited in our resources, so we have to do this in a smart way. So when we started this effort, when Kay started to build a nucleus of people on this team to look at this, I think we very quickly understood that there was a need to have some policies in place, some structure to help us make sure that this is something that's right for the church and doesn't put the church at risk. And we also knew that we couldn't necessarily operate an orphanage or a school or whatever it would be that we'd try to do if it was in far-flung places in the world. So we started to think about, what if we design HCIC to be like a foundation, to be like a new church foundation that would help children. And though we only have, one mission to date, if you think of it in a longer term, if it functions as an entity that can connect resources to people in the church who want to do this type of work, then that helps you understand how we would build the rest of the procedures behind that. So what we looked at then is, if we're going to operate like a foundation, and we're not going to be the ones necessarily operating the orphanage on a day-to-day basis, then we can think about the Sacred Care Orphanage applying to us for resources. They will tell us what their needs are, and then we just simply need to validate those needs and verify that their requests for funds are in fact in line with what their local economy would suggest. So that's really the partnership that we've tried to establish, and all of our policies that have been reviewed by the church's council and have ratified by them as well are designed to nurture that type of partnership. So we have details around always verifying the costs of things and reporting that and documenting that. And when we get to the point, hopefully, when we can purchase land and start building some real project management type of skills around third-party verification and having multiple bids for a large project. And then kind of the last policy is, if there's a request of over $4,000 and it doesn't meet all of our policy requirements and all of our standards, then there must be a unanimous vote within the committee, and we have to, of course, let the general church know about it before we proceed. So we're very conscious of trying to use the money that our gracious donors and sponsors are giving to us in the appropriate way, and then communicating to them that we're doing that. Because we want those checks and balances. That's how everybody will stay out of trouble from those 3 lessons that I talked about. And I think we're extremely fortunate in Samson and the quality of individual that Samson is, and the partnership that is developing between Samson and Sacred Care and HCIC. It's a very high functioning, I'd say, at this point. We've come a long way. There's more development and work to do, but I think we're operating at a very good level. We've shown through Samson's work that we can make this work. We're getting the documentation we need to prove that we're spending the money the right way. He's looking at alternatives. We're getting comparable expenses. So all those types of professional skills that we would want to have in place for an effort we would do here, we're starting to get a lot of that out of Samson and Kenya, and I think that's very encouraging. So when we think about the structure and the more dull aspects of this work, that's kind of the bedrock. It's the foundation that gets us to helping these wonderful children and getting to the stories that Taryn talked about. That's what really matters. And just underneath that, we just have to make sure that we're always coming back to communicating with folks like you who want to support us, and hopefully always improving collectively together. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I didn't want to get too much in the weeds, and maybe I did a little bit, but we wanted to leave some time for questions and answers, because a real big part of our mission is to be transparent. Because we know through transparency we achieve a level of accountability that is difficult to get to otherwise. If there's just a few of us together thinking about how do we solve these problems, we know we're not going to get the right answers every single time. But when we're in front of folks like you, and we have the opportunity to engage in a dialogue, we know that your experiences through life will help us get better at achieving the work that we're trying to do. And again, this is an effort that we want to be broadly in the church. It's an opportunity for those of us in the church to do good works in the world. And I think that, again, to what David was telling us in the charge, that's work that the writings tell us is something we should be thinking about.